The Magic Lake. Pedro sang as he walked up the winding path leading into the forest, his old axe slung over his shoulder. Deep into the woods I go, where wild flowers grow. With my axe I make firewood to sell in my neighborhood since 7 years ago. He was a poor woodcutter, and every morning he left his wife and children to chop firewood, which he sold at the market in the afternoons. He soon noticed a fallen tree by a lake. Perfect, he said. I won't even have to cut this tree. He got to work right away, swinging his axe with mighty blows. Whack, whack, whack. He was working as quickly as he could, wiping the sweat from his brow from time to time. The sun was beating down on his back, and he wanted to finish the job quickly so that he could get to the market early. But as he raised his axe to take another swing, its blade suddenly slipped off and flew into the lake behind him. Oh no, he said as the blade disappeared into the water with a big splash. Pedro had only one axe, and he didn't have enough money to buy a new one. Thinking quickly, he took off his shirt and dove into the water. He swam deeper and deeper, but he couldn't reach the bottom of the lake. He tried many more times, but he just couldn't find the blade. As he sat under the shade of a tree, worrying about how he was going to pay for another axe, a beautiful fairy rose up from the water and magically appeared before him. Pedro gasped at the sight of her. Her hair reached down to her ankles, and her eyes expressed purity and kindness. What's wrong? She asked. Pedro stood up and hastily put his shirt back on. He explained what had just happened. Then the fairy swiftly dove into the lake and emerged with an axe blade that shone brightly in the sun. It was made of pure silver. Is this it? The fairy asked. The woodcutter knew that if he took the blade, he would be the richest man in his local neighborhood, or barrio as it was called. But Pedro shook his head and said, No, that's not mine. The fairy dove into the lake again. Soon she reappeared holding a blade of shining gold. Is this it? She asked. Again the woodcutter thought of how much money he could get for the solid gold blade. But he shook his head and said, No, that's not mine either. Once again, the fairy dove into the water and surfaced, this time holding Pedro's old iron blade. Is this it? Yes, Pedro exclaimed. That's mine. Delighted, he took the blade from the fairy. Thank you so much. I admire your honesty, she said to Pedro. Because you are an honest man, I would like to give you the silver blade and the gold one too. The woodcutter's face brightened. Really? He said. But those might belong to someone else. No, the fairy said. I created those blades for you. Pedro thanked the fairy again, then immediately set off for home. He was excited to show his wife his gold and silver blades. We can sell them, he told his wife when he arrived at their cottage, and we can save the money for the children's schooling. Pedro's wife was very pleased, and she shared the news with all the neighbors. That same night, the woodcutter's story was known all over the barrio. Even the children were talking about the fairy and the gold and silver axes. Everyone was happy except for Pedro's neighbor, Lito. He felt he deserved the gold and silver axes even more than Pedro did. Early the next morning, Lito loosened the blades on two of his axes and headed off to the same spot in the lake. He began cutting down a tree, and just as he had planned, the blade flew off his axe and flew into the lake. Oh no, he exclaimed. Then he grabbed his second axe and took a swing at the tree. That blade slipped off too, splashing into the lake. Oh, he said, both my axes are ruined. Then he sat back and pretended to cry. Before long, the fairy appeared and asked him why he was crying. Lito explained that his axes were broken and that their blades were buried in the lake. As expected, the fairy dove into the water. She appeared first with a silver blade. Is this yours? She asked Lito. You found it, Lito said, pretending to be surprised. What a good diver you are. Do you think you can find the other one? The fairy dove down again and came up with a gold blade. Is this it? She asked. Yes, yes, he said, holding out his hands greedily. That's mine too. But the fairy held on to both of the blades and said, You shall have neither of these blades. I help only those who are honest. Get out of these woods quickly and never come back. Then she vanished. Lito had no choice but to go home feeling very much ashamed. Not any richer, and I've even lost my two axes, he said to himself. I wish I had been wiser and hadn't been so greedy. The end.